change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Joshua. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go.
And so here again, we have now this different group of Hivites. So these Hivites, they're not related to the Gibeonites. And then we have a different group of Jebusites. So these are not the Jebusites from the city of Jerusalem. And along with them are the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Pezerites, and they're from all over the mountains and the lowlands. And so this is a coalition of the kingdoms in northern Canaan. And this is the largest known gathering of armies ever to come against Israel. And they're taking this now or never view of stopping Israel. And so it says here, this army is like the sands of the seashore. And these guys, they're all equipped with superior weaponry because they have horses and horsemen, and they have chariots. And having a chariot in these days would be like having a tank. And then they have a whole lot of infantrymen. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, who is usually pretty accurate in the description of history, he says that there were 300,000 foot soldiers along with 20,000 horsemen with 10,000 chariots. And so Israel here, they're way outnumbered and they're way outweaponed. And there is no way that they would ever to be able to find any confidence in themselves to be able to beat this army. Because it's like it said, this is a sea of men. So their total confidence here, it has to be in God and in what God is doing here. And what he's doing is he's bringing all these kingdoms out into an open area so that Israel does not have to fight with them in a battle in all of their walled cities to go city to city to city. God has this all set up to be able to handle this really quickly. And I don't know if you've ever seen this in your life, but I've seen this in my life, where it seems like there's something that just kind of comes up and it seems like it's going to go on forever and ever and ever. And you're going to be battling with it for years. And then just one day it's all gone and it goes just as quickly as it came, because God can do things like that. And so now you got this huge army and they're all gathered and they're all camping out by the water and they're preparing to fight Israel. And then God speaks to Joshua and he tells him, don't be afraid because of them. And you would think, right. Well, I'm not. Yeah, who wouldn't be afraid of certain death? And then God continues and says, for tomorrow, about this time, I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. And so this is going to be short and sweet. And it's going to be so short and sweet that God tells Joshua what to do right after the battle. And he tells them to hamstring all their horses and burn all their chariots. And hamstring horses means that they're going to cut a tendon in the back of their leg to disable the horse from being able to run. So these horses wouldn't be able to be used for war anymore, but they would be able to walk and they would be able to pull a plow. Because Israel, they're never to put any confidence in any of their own abilities or in anything they ever possess for their success. They weren't to be like these other nations. They were to depend fully on God and on God alone. And we're to be like them. We're to have our only hope for our success to be in God alone, to be able to claim all the things in life that God has for us. And we see here that Joshua, he didn't wait for them to attack. And you'll notice that all the battles that Joshua fights, he initiates. He always took the offense. Israel never fought a defensive battle in Canaan with Joshua. And so Joshua, he chased them and he defeated them. And Joshua, he was obedient to destroy all the weapons of war. And those are all the things that all the other nations looked toward for their success, because that's all they tried to do. They tried to build bigger armies and more weapons of war. And the only city that was destroyed in this northern conquest was the city of Hazor, and it was burned. And Hazor today is the largest tell in Israel. And they've only excavated parts of it, but in it, they found in one of their digs, and it was a dig from around the 13th century, where all the temples were all torn down, and they found a layer of ash, and it's associated with Joshua and the burning of Hazor. But like Ai, Israel got to keep all the spoils and all the livestock from Hazor. And then in chapter 11, we have a summary of all the places that was conquered in the north, and we're told that Joshua made war with these kings for a long time. And so we know that the period of time for the battles in Canaan was somewhere around 7 years, and that's from when they first crossed the river Jordan. And none of these inhabitants of Canaan, they ever sought peace with Israel, except for what we learned last week, the Gibeonites. And here in verse 20, it says, because the Lord hardened their hearts. And it says that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might utterly destroy them, and they might receive no mercy. And this kind of hardening of hearts, it's the same kind of hardening of hearts that occurred with the Pharaoh in Egypt, where what God is doing is that he's hardening them in the things that they were already hardened, which means that God had given these people a time to repent, but they didn't want to. So God is letting them have their way. And that's the way it is, because if we won't repent, God will eventually let us have our way, and he'll harden our hearts where it can be where you won't be saved. And the way this is worded, it sounds like God would have shown them mercy like he did the Gibeonites if they had only changed their ways and turned to him. And I would think that God, he would have also done this with any individual that truly wanted to be saved. I think he would have done it just like he did for Rahab. And I think if any of them could have been saved, God would have saved them. And then this chapter ends with Joshua cutting off the Anakim, which are those giants that made Israel so afraid when they spied out the land and caused Israel to disobey the Lord. So the Anakims are now cut off from the hill country, and they're only left now in the Philistine areas, in the Philistine country, and it says Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. And we will later hear about these giants that live in Gath. And primarily, we'll hear about Goliath, and we'll hear about his brothers, who are the remnants of these giants. And we know that Goliath, he was like 9.5 feet tall. But with all these battles, there was only 3 cities that were destroyed. That was Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. And all the rest of the cities and all the rest of the towns are given to Israel to be divided up by tribe as their inheritance. And in verse 23, the last verse of this chapter, is the first time we ever read the word inheritance. And now, from this point, that word is going to be used dozens of times throughout the rest of this book. And so now that all the battles are over, Israel has peace. And so next week, what we're going to go through is we're going to go up through the dividing of the land. So last week, we finished all the battles led by Joshua in the land of Canaan. And chapter 12 is a review of all the kings and the kingdoms that were conquered by Israel. And in chapter 12, it names 33 kings, and it begins with King Sihon and King Og from over on the east side of the Jordan River, where the kings and kingdoms were conquered under the leadership of Moses. And then under the leadership of Joshua, from over on the west side of the Jordan River, you have 16 kings who are named, who were defeated in the southern campaign. And then you have 15 kings named who were defeated in the northern campaign. So for Joshua, that's 31 kings. And so now Joshua, he has completed the first half of his divine commission. And so now he's conquered all of Israel's enemies. And so now Israel, they're in control of the land with all of its towns and cities. And so now Joshua is going to begin his second half of his commission, and that is to divide and to distribute the land to the tribes. The reason we didn't read all of this would have been like reading a surveyor's report. To Israel, it was really important because it would be kind of like reading a will because it's their inheritance. And so this is what they're going to get. So it's really important to them, but for us, it would have been just really tedious. But I will recommend to you that you go back and you read this all for yourselves because there is a lot of information in these passages. And today we're going to cover a lot of ground, not as much as Joshua, but we're going to get through all these chapters from 12 all the way through 19. And so now when we get to chapter 13, the first thing that we read is that Joshua's old and advanced in years. And that's exactly what the Lord tells Joshua. He says, you're old and advanced in years. And when the Lord tells you you're old, that means you're old. That means you're really old. And in the King James Version, it says, Joshua's stricken in years. And so what that means here is that these years, they have taken their toll on Joshua. And here Joshua is believed to be about 90 to 100 years old, and he will live to be about 110. And then the Lord is telling him that there is a lot more to be done, and there's so much more land to conquer for Israel to claim, but you're too old to lead them and to claim it. And so God primarily is talking about here, he's talking about those 5 cities of the Philistines, and then he's talking about the land of the Gershurites who live up on the north and east side of the Sea of Galilee, and then he's also talking about some of the Sidonians. And even though these areas that they're not conquered yet, you still need to go ahead and divide up the land for these 9.5 tribes, and I will drive the enemy out. And then to the other 2.5 tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, you're to give them now that land on the east side of the Jordan that Moses had already given them. And in that land that they're getting on the east side of the Jordan, we're told in verse 13 that the people of the Gershites and the Maccathites, that they were still dwelling among Israel, among those tribes, until the time of the writing of this book. And those Gershites, they will actually be there in that land until the time of King David 400 years later. Because David, he married the daughter of the king of Geshur, who was a Gershurite, and he had a son with that woman, and that son was Absalom. And then we're told in verse 13 of chapter 13 that the tribe of Levi, that they will receive no inheritance in the land of Israel, because the inheritance that they're going to get is a different kind of inheritance. Their inheritance is going to be being close to God himself, and they're going to be able to share in his sacrifices, that God is their inheritance, which means that he will provide for them, and not only provide for them, but he will himself be their provision. And it's going to say this about the Levites not receiving an inheritance 4 times in these chapters, but they will be receiving 48 cities, and they're going to be receiving these common areas to pasture their herds and cattle. But there will not be a land called Levi land that's all made up of all the Levites. And they're going to be scattered throughout all of Israel in these 48 cities, because these cities are located all throughout Israel, and it's on both sides of the Jordan River. And so this is how that will work. They will leave their cities when it's time for them to do their turn to minister to God at the tabernacle in Shiloh. And then after their service, they will go home, and then they're going to minister to the people of the tribes that they live around and the areas that they live until it's time for them to serve at the tabernacle again. You'll always notice we always talk about these 12 tribes of Israel, but there were actually 13 tribes, because the tribe that would have been called Joseph was actually 2 tribes. And they were the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. Because Jacob, he left the double portion, which would normally be given to the firstborn, he gave that to Joseph. And the way he did it is he did it through his grandkids, where he made each of them a tribe in Israel. And so when they list these 12 tribes of Israel, there will always be one tribe that's left out. Usually it will be the tribe of Levi. But sometimes what they'll do is they'll call it the tribe of Joseph, and they won't mention Ephraim or Manasseh. And then there's other times it just leaves somebody out, like in Revelation, it leaves out the tribe of Dan. But spiritually, we as Christians, we're like the tribe of Levi, because our inheritance too is the Lord himself, where he says that he has made us a nation of priests, with him being our inheritance. And this word inheritance is very important to Israel. And this word inheritance will be used over 50 times in these chapters. And you have to see here that the Jews, they didn't earn the land. They didn't win it by the spoils of war, and they didn't purchase it. This land of Canaan, it belongs to the Lord. He owns it. And Israel is only his tenants, where God is actually leasing the land to them. So it means it can never be sold by them permanently because it doesn't belong to them. It belongs to God. God is their landlord. And what they pay for rent is they pay by obedience to his laws. And so as long as the Jewish people, they honor the Lord with their worship and with their obedience, they can stay in the land. And if they do that, God will make them happy and he'll make them productive, and he will give them peace with their neighbors. But if they don't pay their rent, if they're not obedient, they will be expelled from the land. And if you remember a couple weeks ago that all of Israel, they gathered in front of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, that was basically Israel agreeing to their rental contract with God. And they call that the Palestinian covenant, where they're going to be blessed for their obedience and cursed for their disobedience. But Israel's inheriting of the land and occupying the land, it's only a gracious act on God's part here. He never had to do this. The promised land here, it's always been a gift of love to Israel, and he's never done anything like this for any other nation. Though I do believe that God will bless any nation that's willing to walk with him. And I believe that's why we as America have been blessed all these years, because we began as a people who believed in God. And we tried to follow what was laid out in his Bible, in the most part. But even if our country won't follow God any longer, I believe that God will bless any person who's willing to put their faith in him and believe him and obey his word, because God will always bless the people who love him. And so now with Israel, they're camping out at Gilgal, and there's going to be 4 stages to the dividing of the land. With the first stage happening at Gilgal, and we're going to see the very first tribe to receive their inheritance will be those 2.5 tribes from the east side of the Jordan River, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. They're getting these areas that they've already received, which nowadays is called the country of Jordan. So it's not even Israel. And with these 2.5 tribes, their families, they've already been living within their inheritance, but it's only their men of war that have been away from their families now, and they've been away for about 7 years, because that's the deal that they made with Moses, where their men would have to cross over and fight and stay there until the battles were over. And that deal was really good for their cattle, but it wasn't that good for their children or the future of their tribes, because it doesn't seem like this was the plan that God had for them. This was just the compromise that he made for them. And these lands, they became kind of a buffer zone, because these people, they're living between the land of Canaan, and they're also living between the pagan lands of Moab and Ammon. Okay, so here on the map, we can see that Reuben, he's given the south portion of the east side of the Dead Sea. And then in the northern area, around the Sea of Galilee, up in that little darker tan section on the east side of the Jordan, that's given to the half tribe of Manasseh. And then stuck right between the middle of them is the tribe of Gad. And then the rest of this chapter is given the legal description of the territories given to Reuben. And then we find out what happened to Balaam, the prophet of God, who had betrayed Israel to Balak of Moab, and how he was actually killed in these wars by Israel. And so now, with everyone still camping out at Gilgal, Israel initiates their first national lottery. So they're all going to play the lotto, but they're not going to be winning any money because this lottery is to find out which tribe gets which territory. But this is not a lottery of chance where everything is just left up to luck. This is a lottery that's been commanded by Moses way back in the book of Numbers. And this lottery was also supposed to consider the size of the tribes of Israel. These instructions about the size was given in Numbers 33. But the inheritance by lots is not considered to be just arbitrary. They believe that all of this is being directed by God. And you're not going to see any of these tribes ever disputing or fighting over what God has given them here. There's going to be no arguments. And the word lots here is used 22 times in these chapters. And to make sure that there is no favoritism going on, this lottery will be administered by Joshua and Eleazar, the high priest, with all the leaders of the tribes being present. And some people think that this lottery was performed with the Urim and the Thummim. But the Talmud, which is only tradition, it says it was done by these two urns, where one would contain the name of the tribes and the other contained the territories. And they were both drawn out simultaneously. And this first lottery in Gilgal, it's kind of like the Powerball lottery. This is the big one. And this was for the largest tribes. And it's only going to be the 9.5 tribes that are in this drawing of the lotto. The other 2.5 tribes, they've already received their land outside of the land of Canaan. But before any lottery ever takes place, Caleb, he comes up to Joshua because he's not interested in getting his inheritance from any kind of lottery because he has a promised inheritance. And that promise for his inheritance, it came from the Lord directly through Moses himself. Because Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, it says he wholly followed the Lord. And so that says that Caleb was very faithful. And that phrase, wholly following the Lord, well, that's repeated 6 times in the scriptures. And so you might want to think with Caleb bringing this up here that he's kind of bragging here, but he's not. He's really not. He's only quoting what Moses said about him. And the promise that Caleb received was that he would receive that land where his foot had trodden. And we're told here that Caleb, he's 40 years old when he was sent out as a spy, and that he was a representative of the tribe of Judah. And what's interesting here is that even though Caleb is from the tribe of Judah, he is also called a Kenizzite. And that's a Kenizzite, and that's from being on his father's side.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,